Penelope's hands trembled as she wiped down the mahogany desk in Richard Castellano's private study. The afternoon sun filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden light across the papers scattered before her. She shouldn't look. She never looked. In the 3 months she'd worked at the Castellano estate, she'd perfected the art of being invisible, dusting around confidential documents, vacuuming near whispered phone conversations, existing in the spaces between danger and domesticity. But today, one particular document caught her eye. It wasn't the elegant letterhead or the impressive signatures that made her breath catch. It was the language in Section 7, subsection C, words that sent ice through her veins because she recognized them, words that had destroyed her life once before. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She should move away. She should finish cleaning and disappear back into the kitchen where she belonged. But her eyes, trained by years she'd tried to forget, traced the clause again and again. "No," she whispered to the empty room. "This can't be right." The door opened. Penelope jumped, her cleaning cloth falling to the floor as Richard Castellano himself walked in. 6 feet 3 inches of controlled power, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her yearly salary. His dark eyes, the kind that could order a man's death without blinking, swept the room and landed on her with casual indifference. "Are you still here?" he said, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. I was just finishing, Mr. Castellano." Penelope bent quickly to retrieve her cloth, hoping he hadn't noticed her staring at his papers, hoping her face didn't betray the alarm bells screaming in her mind. But as she straightened, her eyes met his, and before she could stop herself, before years of keeping her head down and her mouth shut could silence her, the words tumbled out. "Excuse me, sir, but this clause is a trap." Richard Castellano's smile, the polite, dismissive expression he wore for people he considered beneath his notice, froze on his face. Then slowly, impossibly, it faded completely. What did you just say? What secret was Penelope hiding? Why did a simple maid recognize legal language that most lawyers would miss? And what would happen now that she'd spoken words that could change everything? The answers would shock Richard Castellano to his core and expose a world of injustice he never knew existed. But first, Penelope had to survive what came next. 3 months earlier, Penelope had walked up the curved driveway of the Castellano estate with her last $15 in her pocket and desperation in her heart. The mansion loomed before her like something from a movie, all stone and glass and power. She clutched her worn resume, carefully edited to show only her recent jobs: housekeeper at a motel, cleaning lady for an office building, night shift at a diner. Everything else, her real past, had been carefully erased. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had looked her up and down with the practiced eye of someone who'd hired dozens of desperate women before. "You understand discretion?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that what you see here, what you hear here, stays here?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you understand that Mr. Castellano values invisibility in his staff? No questions, no curiosity, no, I understand perfectly." Penelope had met Mrs. Chen's eyes with quiet dignity. "I need this job. I won't cause any problems." That had been true. For 3 months, Penelope had been the perfect invisible employee. She arrived at 6 a.m., cleaned the assigned rooms, ate her lunch in the staff quarters, and left by 4 p.m. She never lingered in hallways when Richard held meetings. She never glanced at the documents that covered his desk. She never reacted when she overheard conversations about shipments, territories, or deals that definitely weren't legal. She'd built a wall between who she was and who she'd been, between Penelope Carter, domestic worker, and Penelope Carter, former junior associate at Morrison, Webb & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, the firm where she'd been destroyed. But now, staring at Richard Castellano's contract, while her heart threatened to beat out of her chest, Penelope felt that wall crumbling. Because Section 7, subsection C contained the exact same poisoned language that had been used to steal her career, her reputation, and everything she'd worked for. And she wouldn't, stay silent while someone else fell into that trap. Even if that someone was a man who could make her disappear with a phone call. Richard's dark eyes bored into her, all traces of casual indifference gone. In 3 swift steps he crossed the room and stood before her. so close she could smell his cologne, cedar and something darker, more dangerous. You recognized something in this contract. It wasn't a question. His voice had dropped to a lethal whisper. Explain. Now. Penelope's mouth went dry. Every survival instinct screamed at her to lie, to backtrack, to run. But another part of her, the part that had spent 2 years rebuilding herself from ashes, refused to bow. Section 7, subsection C, she said quietly, forcing her voice steady. The clause about dispute resolution, it looks standard, but it's not. The arbitration requirement is binding only on you, not on Salvatore Grimaldi. The language is deliberately vague. Any party may seek versus all parties shall be bound by. It means Grimaldi can sue you in court, but you can only go to arbitration. With an arbitrator he chooses. You sign this, you're giving him a loaded gun. The silence that followed felt like drowning. Richard stared at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since she'd started working for him. His jaw tightened. Something shifted in his expression, like a predator recognizing intelligence in what he'd assumed was prey. "Who are you?" he asked slowly. In that moment, as Richard Castellano's world tilted on its axis, Penelope knew there was no going back. The secret she'd buried was clawing its way to the surface. But revealing her past meant exposing the injustice that had destroyed her, and the powerful people who wanted to keep her silent. Would Richard believe her? Or would he see her as just another threat to eliminate? The truth was about to explode, and no one would be the same after. "I need you to sit down," Richard said, his voice carrying that tone of absolute authority that made even his most dangerous associates obey without question. He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. Penelope didn't move. "I should go. I shouldn't have said anything." "Sit down." Not a request. Her legs obeyed before her mind could protest. She sank into the chair, the same chair where she'd seen Richard conduct million-dollar negotiations, where men in expensive suits had sat and tried to hide their fear. Now she sat there in her simple black cleaning dress, her natural curls pulled back in a practical bun, facing a man who could destroy what little life she'd rebuilt. Richard moved around the desk, picked up the contract, and set it in front of her. Then he pulled up a second chair, not behind his desk in the position of power, but beside her, close enough that she could see the sharp intelligence in his dark eyes. "Read it," he commanded. "All of it. Tell me what else I'm missing." "Mr. Castellano, Richard." He leaned back, studying her with unnerving intensity. "And you're going to tell me your real name, your real story. But first you're going to tell me every single trap in this contract, because if you're right about Section 7, there's a reason you know it, and I'm going to find out what that reason is." Penelope's hands shook as she pulled the contract closer. Her mind was already analyzing, dissecting, seeing patterns that most people, even most lawyers, would miss. It was like muscle memory. This ability to read between the lines of legal language, the skill that had once been her greatest asset, and then became her greatest curse. "Section 4, the payment terms," she began, her voice growing steadier as she slipped back into the professional persona she'd buried. "The initial payment of $5 million is clear, but the additional compensation based on performance metrics to be mutually agreed upon, that's a time bomb. There's no definition of what those metrics are, who defines them, or what happens if you disagree. Grimaldi could claim you haven't met metrics you never agreed to, withhold payment and sue you for breach when you don't deliver more." Richard's expression darkened. "Continue." "Section 9, the confidentiality clause. It's one-sided. You're bound to absolute silence about this deal and all related business. He's bound to reasonable discretion. That's not enforceable against him, but it's a hammer he can use against you. If anything about this deal goes public, you're automatically in breach. He can leak everything and face no consequences. Keep going." For the next 20 minutes, Penelope dissected the contract piece by piece. She showed him the hidden escape clauses that gave Grimaldi complete flexibility while locking Richard into ironclad obligations. She pointed out the liability provisions that shifted all risk onto Richard's shoulders. She explained how the indemnification language would make Richard responsible for any legal troubles that arose, even troubles Grimaldi himself caused. By the time she finished, Richard's face had gone from dark to thunderous. "This entire contract," he said slowly, "is designed to destroy me." "Yes." Penelope met his eyes. "Whoever drafted this is very, very good. The language looks standard on the surface. Most lawyers would approve it. But underneath, it's a masterclass in legal manipulation. Sign this, and Salvatore Grimaldi owns you. And when he's done using you, he can destroy you without breaking a single law." Richard stood abruptly, pacing to the window, his hands clenched at his sides, the only visible sign of rage in a man who'd built an empire on controlling his emotions. "I've done business with Grimaldi for 5 years," he said quietly. "I trusted him. This deal, this partnership, was supposed to expand my territory, legitimize some of my operations. My lawyers reviewed this contract, 3 of them. They all said it was fine. They're either incompetent or paid off." The words came out flat, certain. Richard turned sharply. "You sound very sure about that." "I am. Because this has happened to you before." It wasn't a question. Penelope felt the walls closing in, felt the weight of the past she'd tried to escape pressing down on her chest. But there was no hiding now. No going back to being invisible. "Yes," she whispered, "this exact same kind of contract happened to me, and it destroyed my entire life." The words hung in the air between them, a confession, a warning, a shared wound. Richard Castellano, a man who trusted no one, suddenly saw Penelope not as a servant, but as someone who'd been broken by the same kind of betrayal he'd almost walked into. What he didn't know yet was that the same powerful firm that had tried to trap him had already destroyed her, and they'd do it again if they discovered she was still alive, still fighting. But Richard Castellano didn't let anyone hurt what was his, and Penelope was about to become exactly that. "Tell me everything." Richard returned to the chair beside her, this time even closer. His presence, intimidating, powerful, but somehow not threatening, wrapped around Penelope like a command she couldn't refuse. She took a shaky breath. The story she'd never told anyone, the truth she'd buried under 3 years of silence, clawed its way up her throat. "My name is Penelope Elizabeth Carter. 4 years ago I graduated top of my class from Northwestern Law. I got hired at Morrison, Webb & Associates, one of the biggest corporate law firms in Chicago. It was my dream job. I worked 80-hour weeks, did everything perfectly, and after 2 years, I made junior associate." Richard listened without interrupting, his dark eyes never leaving her face. 3 years ago, I was assigned to a major case. A client wanted to acquire a rival company, hostile takeover. I was tasked with reviewing the acquisition contracts, and I found something. Her voice cracked. "Hidden clauses just like in your contract. Brilliant, nearly invisible legal traps that would have destroyed the target company and exposed our client to massive liability. You reported it. I reported it to my supervising partner, James Webb himself. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting the firm, protecting the client." She laughed bitterly. "I was so naive. What did Webb do? He thanked me, told me to rewrite the contracts correctly. I did. I worked 3 days straight to fix every trap, every hidden clause. I submitted the clean version." Penelope's hands clenched in her lap. 2 weeks later, I was called into a meeting. Webb, Morrison, and 2 senior partners. They accused me of falsifying documents. They said the original contracts, the ones with all the traps, were my work, that I'd tried to sabotage the deal. Richard's jaw tightened. "They framed you." "Perfectly. They had emails with my name on them, documents with my electronic signature, everything. I tried to defend myself, but I was one junior associate against the entire leadership of the firm. They said I'd had a mental breakdown from stress, that I was delusional. They offered me a choice, resign quietly, and they wouldn't report me to the Bar Association, or fight, and they'd destroy my career and reputation completely. You resigned. I had law school debt, no savings, no family to help me. My parents died when I was in college. I couldn't afford to fight them." Tears burned in Penelope's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I signed their severance agreement, which included ironclad NDAs and non-disparagement clauses. They gave me 3 months' salary and a reference that said I'd voluntarily resigned to pursue other opportunities. Then they blacklisted me. Blacklisted? I applied to 43 other law firms. None would hire me. I finally learned through a friend that Morrison, Webb had quietly spread rumors that I was unstable, unreliable, not fit for serious legal work. I couldn't get a job as a paralegal. Couldn't get a job as a legal secretary. I couldn't even get a job at a copy shop near a courthouse. They all knew someone at the firm. Richard's hands had curled into fists. So you became invisible. I changed my resume, left off my law degree, my bar admission, everything that connected me to that world. I became just another woman working cleaning jobs to survive, and for 3 years I told myself that was enough, that I'd just exist in the shadows and try to forget, until you saw my contract, until I saw the exact same poisoned language. Penelope finally met his eyes. Those clauses in your contract, they're James Webb's signature work. I'd recognize his style anywhere. He's the one who drafted the original trap contracts at the firm, the ones they framed me for. And I'm betting he's the one who drafted your contract with Grimaldi. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stood slowly, moved back to his desk, and picked up his phone. "Anthony," he said into it, "I need the name of the law firm that drafted the Grimaldi contract. Now." A pause. Then, "Morrison, Webb and Associates, boss, out of Chicago." Richard's eyes locked on Penelope's, and what she saw there made her breath catch. It was rage, yes, cold and controlled and absolutely deadly. But underneath it was something else, something that looked almost like respect. "Anthony," Richard said, still watching her, "cancel the Grimaldi meeting. Tell him I need another week to review the contract and get me everything, and I mean everything, on Morrison, Webb and Associates and a former associate named Penelope Elizabeth Carter." He ended the call. "You saved my life today," he said quietly, "or at least saved my empire. A debt like that doesn't go unpaid in my world." "I don't want payment," Penelope whispered. "I just couldn't watch them do to someone else what they did to me." "Well, that's unfortunate." Richard moved around the desk, leaning against it in front of her. "Because I always pay my debts. And right now, Penelope Elizabeth Carter, I owe you everything. Which means you're about to get 2 things, justice and protection, whether you want them or not." In that moment, everything changed. Richard Castellano, a man who ruled Chicago's underworld with an iron fist, had just declared war on one of the city's most powerful law firms. But Morrison, Webb and Associates had destroyed countless people who dared oppose them. They had connections, money, and absolutely no conscience. The moment they discovered Penelope was still in Chicago, still alive, still capable of exposing their crimes, they'd come for her with everything they had. And Richard's protection might be the only thing standing between Penelope and complete annihilation. But protection from a mafia boss came with a price all its own. The next 48 hours passed in a blur that Penelope would remember for the rest of her life. Richard didn't just investigate Morrison, Webb and Associates, he dissected them. His people worked around the clock, and what they found made Penelope's destruction look like amateur hour. Webb and Morrison had been running the same scheme for years, creating deliberately flawed contracts for powerful clients, then using those flaws to blackmail, control, or destroy anyone who became inconvenient. They'd ruined competitors, silenced whistleblowers, and made millions in the process. And Penelope hadn't been their only victim. "There are at least 7 others," Anthony, Richard's second-in-command, reported during a meeting in the study. Penelope sat in the corner. Still wearing her cleaning uniform because she hadn't been home, Richard had assigned 2 guards to watch her apartment and had insisted she stay at the estate until this is handled. Whatever that meant. 7 lawyers, all women, all brilliant, all destroyed by accusations of misconduct or instability. All of them signed NDAs. All of them disappeared from the legal profession. "Where are they now?" Richard asked. 2 are working retail, 1's a bartender. 3 left the state entirely. We're tracking them down. 1... Anthony's expression darkened. 1 committed suicide 6 months after leaving the firm. Penelope felt the blood drain from her face. She'd almost been that last one. There'd been nights So many nights when the weight of injustice and loss had felt crushing enough to end it all. Richard's eyes found hers across the room. What she saw there wasn't pity, it was understanding and rage. "Webb and Morrison are going to pay for every single life they destroyed," he said quietly. "But we need to be smart about this. They're connected to judges, politicians, other firms. A direct attack would get messy." "So what do you propose?" Anthony asked. "We give them exactly what they gave Penelope, a perfect trap they won't see until it's too late." Richard turned to her. "And we're going to need a brilliant lawyer to design it. Penelope, I need you to come work for me, not as a housekeeper, as my legal counsel." Penelope's heart stuttered. I can't practice law. I'm technically still licensed, but after what they did to my reputation, you'll be working for me, not applying to law firms. My organization needs someone who can review contracts, identify traps, and protect my interests. Someone I can trust absolutely." His voice softened slightly. "Someone who understands what it means to be destroyed by people who were supposed to have your back." "Why?" The question came out as a whisper. "Why would you do this for me? You don't know me. I'm just—" "You're not just anything." Richard crossed the room, stopping directly in front of her. "You're brilliant, courageous, and you've survived something that would have broken most people. You saw injustice and spoke up even when it could have cost you everything again. That's not weakness, Penelope. That's strength. And I want that strength on my side." Tears finally spilled down Penelope's cheeks. 3 years of invisible pain, of swallowing rage and shame, of believing she was worthless, all of it cracked open at his words. "They'll come after me," she whispered. "When they find out I'm helping you, when they realize I can expose them, let them try." Richard's voice dropped to that lethal whisper. "I've built an empire by protecting what's mine, and you, Penelope Elizabeth Carter, are now under my protection. Anyone who touches you answers to me." Something shifted in that moment, something that had nothing to do with employment or legal strategy. Penelope looked up at Richard Castellano, truly looked at him, and saw past the Mafia boss, past the dangerous reputation, past the power and wealth. She saw a man who understood loyalty, who valued intelligence and courage, who was offering her something no one else ever had, the chance to fight back. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, I'll do it." Richard smiled, a real smile this time, not the polite mask he showed the world. "Good, because I've already had your office prepared, and tomorrow we're going to start building the most beautiful legal trap Morrison, Webb and Associates has ever seen." From invisible maid to trusted counsel, Penelope's transformation had begun. But as she stepped back into the world of law, this time with the full power of Richard Castellano's empire behind her, Morrison, Webb and Associates would soon discover they'd made a fatal mistake 3 years ago. They hadn't destroyed Penelope Carter. They'd forged her into something far more dangerous. And now, with loyalty, protection, and a brilliant plan forming between her and Richard, justice was finally coming. But revenge was only the beginning of what would grow between them. 3 months later, Penelope sat in Richard's study, but this time behind her own desk, surrounded by law books, 3 computer monitors, and a stack of contracts that would have made her former firm weep with envy. Her natural curls, no longer pulled back in a severe bun, framed her face in soft coils. She wore a tailored navy suit that Richard had insisted on buying her. "My counsel represents me," he'd said. "She needs to look the part." But the real transformation wasn't the clothes or the office. It was the light in her eyes, the confidence in her shoulders, the way she moved through the world like she deserved to take up space again. "You're smiling," Richard said. Walking in with 2 cups of coffee, he set one on her desk, cream, no sugar, exactly how she liked it. He'd noticed. He always noticed. "I'm winning," Penelope replied, gesturing to her computer screen. "James Webb just walked into our trap." Over the past 3 months, they'd worked together to create something beautiful. A seemingly legitimate business deal between Richard's legitimate real estate company and a venture capital firm. The contracts were perfect, clean, professional, profitable for both sides. Webb's firm had been hired by the VC firm to review the deal, and hidden inside those perfect contracts were 7 nearly invisible clauses, each one a masterpiece of legal manipulation that would slowly transfer control and liability entirely onto the VC firm, and by extension, onto Morrison, Webb, and Associates themselves. Webb approved the contracts this morning, Penelope continued, pulling up the email. He didn't catch a single trap. In 6 months, when the first liability trigger hits, the VC firm will sue Morrison. Webb for malpractice. By then, we'll have documentation showing that Webb deliberately ignored obvious warning signs, the same way he framed me. And the other victims? Richard asked, moving to stand beside her desk. I've been working with them, all 7 women. They're ready to come forward with their stories once Webb's reputation starts cracking. The NDAs they signed were procured through fraud, unconscionable and unenforceable. I've got the legal precedents ready. Penelope looked up at him. We're going to destroy them, Richard. Legally, completely, and publicly. You're magnificent, Richard said softly. And the way he looked at her like she was something precious and powerful all at once made her breath catch. Something had been building between them over these months. It was there in the late nights working together, in the way he brought her coffee without asking, in how he'd cancelled a meeting with a weapons dealer because she'd needed his advice on a contract. It was there in the careful respect he showed her, in how he never made her feel less than despite their vastly different worlds. And it was there in moments like this, when his dark eyes held hers and she felt something deeper than gratitude or loyalty, stirring in her chest. Richard, she said quietly, why are you really doing this? This war with Webb and Morrison, it's cost you time, money, resources. You could have just avoided Grimaldi's deal and moved on. You know why. He leaned against her desk, close enough that she could see the faint stubble on his jaw, smell his cedar cologne. Tell me anyway. Because I've spent my entire life in a world where power means everything and loyalty means nothing, where people betray you for money, for position, for fear. And then I met a woman who risked everything twice just to do what was right, who saved me not because she wanted something from me, but because she couldn't stand by and watch injustice happen again. His voice dropped. You reminded me that honor still exists, Penelope, and I'm not letting anyone hurt you ever again. The air between them crackled with something electric, dangerous, inevitable. I'm falling for you, Penelope whispered, the truth escaping before she could stop it. And I know that's complicated and probably stupid, but... Richard's hand came up, gentle fingers tracing her jawline. Complicated? Yes. Stupid? Never. I started falling for you the moment you looked me in the eye and told me my contract was a trap. Every day since, watching you rebuild yourself, watching you fight. He paused, something vulnerable flickering in his expression. I've never met anyone like you, Penelope, and I'm not letting you go. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, a question, not a demand. But when she responded, rising from her chair to wrap her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened into something that felt like promise, like home, like everything she'd thought she'd lost when her world fell apart. We're going to destroy them together, Richard murmured against her lips. And then we're going to build something better, something real. Yes, Penelope breathed. Together. Love and loyalty, justice and power. Penelope and Richard had found all of it in each other. But the final confrontation with Morrison, Webb and Associates was still to come. And when James Webb discovered who had been behind his carefully constructed downfall, when he realized the unstable junior associate he'd destroyed was now the brilliant legal mind protecting one of Chicago's most powerful men. The explosion would be spectacular. The ending they'd built together would be perfect, and nothing would ever tear them apart again. 6 months later, Penelope stood beside Richard in a federal courthouse, watching as James Webb and Gerald Morrison were led away in handcuffs. The malpractice lawsuit had been just the beginning. Once Webb's reputation started cracking, all 7 women had come forward with their stories. The media had descended like sharks smelling blood, and when the Illinois State Bar opened an investigation, they'd found a pattern of fraud, forgery, and manipulation spanning 15 years. Morrison, Webb and Associates was finished. The firm had filed for bankruptcy. Both senior partners faced disbarment and criminal charges. Their clients had fled, their legacy was destroyed, and Penelope had been there for every moment of it. "How do you feel?" Richard asked, his arms solid and warm around her waist. "Like I can finally breathe," Penelope admitted. She'd testified at the bar hearing, faced Webb across a conference table, and watched him realize exactly who had destroyed him. The look on his face when he'd recognized her, shock, fear, rage, had been sweeter than any revenge she could have imagined. "What now?" Richard asked. Penelope turned to him. This man who'd given her back herself, who'd protected her, believed in her, loved her. "Now we keep building. Your empire needs a brilliant legal counsel, and you need to be the powerful, brilliant woman you always were," Richard finished. "I know, and I'm going to make sure the whole world sees it." 3 weeks later, the Chicago Tribune ran a profile, From Maid to Legal Mastermind, the woman who brought down a corrupt law firm. It told Penelope's story, all of it, the injustice, the survival, the triumph, and it ended with her new position as general counsel for Castellano Enterprises, one of Chicago's most powerful real estate development companies. Job offers started pouring in from law firms who wanted her talent, her story, her reputation as the woman who'd stood up to corruption and won. Penelope turned them all down. She had everything she needed right where she was. "Another late night?" Richard asked, finding her in her office at 9 p.m., reviewing contracts for a new development deal. "Just finishing up." She saved her work and stood, moving into his embrace like she belonged there, because she did. "I have something for you," Richard said, pulling a small box from his pocket. Penelope's heart stuttered. "Richard, it's not what you think. Not yet." He opened the box to reveal a key. "This is to the estate. I want you to move in. No more small apartment, no more commuting. I want you here with me where you're safe and protected and home." Tears pricked her eyes. "That's a big step." "I know, but I've never been more certain of anything." Richard cupped her face in his hands, his dark eyes intense and honest. "You're my partner, Penelope. In business, in justice, in life. And I love you. Completely. Absolutely. Forever." "I love you too," she whispered. "And yes. Yes to all of it." The kiss they shared was different from that first kiss months ago. This one tasted like triumph and promise, and a future they'd build together. One where justice wasn't just a dream, where loyalty meant everything, and where a black woman who'd been told she was nothing proved that she was everything. As they left the office hand in hand, Penelope caught her reflection in the window. She barely recognized herself from the invisible maid who'd walked these halls a year ago. That woman had been broken, hiding, afraid. This woman was whole, powerful, loved, free. And she would never be invisible again.